I first want to thank all the subscribers who've submitted their own true personal stories. Sharing your stories with the world takes courage, and I apologize for it taking so long to make this subscriber video. So I want to thank Ms.S, Miss Kyzoni, and Max Dunham for sharing their childhood ghost stories with me. If you guys want to help out my channel, you can submit your true ghost stories at horrorstudio1@gmail.com. In the meantime, enjoy. Story 1. Preface. A bit of some history for you. My childhood was rough. I was the oldest of many siblings and encountered quite a bit of abuse as a child, physical, mental, and sexual. Which is why I like to remain anonymous. Throughout my childhood, I have lived with almost all members of my family, as were my siblings. Whoever had the ability and the means to care for us would do so. This was to keep us out of the foster system. I was around 10 or 11 years old at the time. Once again, we were taken from my mom's custody and went to stay with relatives. It was summer, and we chose to spend it with my uncle, my aunt, and my cousins. It was exciting and felt that it was like a very long sleepover. I have 2 sisters that came with me. One sister was about 8. The other was around 2 or 3. My aunt and uncle had a large household with a small home, 3 rooms, and a total of 7 to 10 children, depending on the time frame. All the girls in one room, the boys in the other, and my baby sister, who was around 2 or 3, stayed in my aunt and uncle's room in a crib. For this, we will call my baby sister Sarah. Sarah had toys in her crib, a few stuffed animals, and a few electronic toys. Since the household was so large, we spent the majority of our time outside. My uncle wasn't wealthy. We never really had much, but he did the best for us, giving us as much as he could. The background had an above-ground pool and a trampoline. Not the best or the biggest, but it was enough for us kids. We had many times experienced some unexplainable occurrences in this house and were openly told about the previous owner, an old woman who had died peacefully in the home. Being curious, my cousins and I had tried several times to make contact with the old woman, but didn't succeed. The odd part about all of this was that the actions to come actually fit the description of a child, not an old lady. You'll see why in a moment. A few weeks after we moved in, something strange started happening. My baby sister, Sarah, began to talk to a little girl. I was young and I forgot what she called her, but she told us the name and what she looked like, as a toddler could best describe, that is. We didn't think much of it. Having an imaginary friend isn't rare for children, especially for those who have undergone several drastic changes in their lives, so we all assumed that she made an imaginary friend. But then Sarah started saying strange things. She said that the girl didn't like the toys in her crib. For some reason, the toys made her mad. At first, we assumed that Sarah didn't like the toys placed in the crib with her, but it wasn't where the toys were placed that this little girl didn't like. She told Sarah that she just despised the toys themselves. Now, we got in trouble quite a bit. If you put that many children together, they will come up with things to do that are against the rules. My other sister, being the typical middle child, acted out quite a bit. I now have 2 children of my own, so I give props to my aunt and uncle for putting up with all our crap back then. My aunt and uncle woke early since my uncle was a laborer and did physically demanding jobs. We lived in Texas, which gets incredibly hot and humid in the summer, averaging about 105 degrees Fahrenheit with 80% humidity. He worked early to beat the heat. One morning, around 4 a.m., We were woken for a family meeting, which meant somebody was in trouble. We all headed into the living room where my aunt and uncle began the investigation. As I said before, we got in trouble a lot. Their form of punishment reminds me of my Reserves Officers Training Corps days. We all had to sit in there, none of us were allowed to talk, and we could not get up and play until someone came forward. In Reserves Officers Training Corps, when a cadet did something wrong or spoke out against the officers, the entire platoon would be punished. Usually somebody always came forward after a while. Punishment was then secluded to the person who broke the rules. This could be a timeout, or a spanking, depending on how they felt that day. My uncle calmly sat down and asked, "Which one of you put Sarah's toys on the front porch?" No answer. We all began looking around at each other, attempting to get a guilty look from the person responsible. I noticed that we all shared the same confused and sleepy look. Noticing the same expressions, my uncle said, "The toys in Sarah's crib are all sitting on the front porch. They were in her crib when we went to sleep. Somebody went into our room when we were sleeping, took the toys and placed them outside. I want to know who did it." Still, no answer. The longer I have to wait for an answer, the more pissed off I'm going to be. I'm already running late for work, and I don't have all day to wait. Once more, not a sound out of any of us. My uncle took my aunt to the kitchen and told her that we were to sit there until someone came forward. He had to go to work. He gave her a kiss, and angrily, he slammed the door and left. My aunt asked my sister if she moved her toys. She said no. She asked her if she saw any of us enter her room last night, which was off limits when they were asleep. She said no. After a moment of silence that felt like hours, Sarah said, "The little girl put them outside because she didn't like them. She wants you to get her a baby doll." Now Sarah is around 2 or 3, so I'm adding appropriate dialogue to make up for a lack of vocabulary. Suddenly, the suspicion fell on Sarah, and exhausted, my aunt let us go back to sleep. It was around 5 o'clock in the morning, and my aunt wasn't ready to ruin her day. We went to our rooms and climbed into our bunk beds, attempting to go back to sleep. My cousin looked over to my sister and asked if she took the toys, knowing that she was a troublemaker. My sister said no. We all started talking and questioning each other like we were investigating a murder scene. We knew that if somebody didn't admit to it when we wake up again, we would all be in trouble and none of us would be allowed to play. After questioning the other suspects, we all just assumed that it had been one of the boys, so we went back to sleep. When I woke up, I went to ask the boys which one of them did it. They assured me it wasn't them and that it must be one of us. They apparently spent the entire night playing a video game together. With this new alibi, I knew it either had to be both of them working together, or they were telling the truth and it was one of us. Eventually, we were all awake. Then out of nowhere, I became the new prime suspect. It felt like we were playing in the game of Clue, bouncing from person to person with intense questioning. Since I was the first to wake and asked the boys if they played a part in it, I gained a new suspicion of trying to reverse psychology on everyone. My cousin said that I was trying too hard to sound innocent, making everyone assume that I couldn't possibly do it if I was trying on my own to solve this case. She gave me too much credit. Most kids don't think it through like that. Why weren't we this sophisticated and intelligent in school? My aunt felt bad that we were all punished for one person's actions, and she let us off the hook after we sat silently for an hour. She said, "Somebody better come clean before my uncle came home or we're gonna be in a ton of trouble." We went about playing, forgetting about the ordeal. As children, our ability to focus is low and our concentration questionable. My uncle came home from work, and the punishment reminded us all that we were still in trouble. My aunt told him what Sarah had said about the little girl. Since nobody admitted to it, he went ahead and assumed that Sarah's imaginary friend made her take them outside. Like clockwork, we were in bed once again. It was the weekend, so my uncle didn't have work. He slept in until 8, and we were all fast asleep. He woke us up once again and demanded we go to the living room. It was like deja vu, the same questions, but now he had a pissed off tone. Not surprisingly, none of us admitted to it. We were forced to endure the punishment of an hour sitting in silence. We weren't allowed to talk or play with anything. My sister started stacking coasters and balance testing ways. My uncle yelled at her that the punishment wasn't to play only with items that weren't toys, but we weren't allowed to play or move with anything. That 1 hour felt like days. This was before cell phones, so we had no way of sneaking a phone for entertainment. We finally were free and went about our day. That night, my aunt and uncle placed the toys on their dresser instead of Sarah's crib. The dresser was on the furthest side of the room, away from the door. They figured that having to walk all the way around their bed would wake them up, revealing the troublemaker. Again, he woke to the missing toys that he, once again, found on the front porch. Sarah kept blaming her imaginary friend. She said that the little girl won't stop until the toys were thrown away and a doll was bought. Refusing to give in, and probably too curious to get rid of the toys for the little girl, my uncle placed them inside of his dresser, knowing that the opening of the drawer would surely wake up. The following day had the same results of the days before it. We were all extremely frustrated. It was no longer about the incident. My uncle gained an obsession with finding out which one of us was messing with him so much. He finally reached the point of frustration, not punishing us as a whole anymore. He was ready to start his new techniques. Back from work, my uncle walked in with a bag from Home Depot. In view of everyone, he then replaced the front and back door deadbolts. This new deadbolt had to be opened with a key from both sides. He put the keys around his neck on a lanyard. The house was pretty old and the neighborhood wasn't that safe, so the windows had bars on them, a common thing in the poorer neighborhoods of Houston. Now, he figured that there was no possible way to get out the door without him. He was a light sleeper, usually heading to bed around 10 p.m. Because of this, their room was off limits when my uncle was sleeping, ensuring that we didn't wake him up, making him tired at work. With the lanyard under his shirt, he assumed it was foolproof. My aunt usually went to bed around midnight. Being the summer, us kids stayed up very late sometimes. With no squeeze out the windows and no ability to unlock the doors, we all figured that was the last of it. My uncle placed the toys back in the crib thinking that this couldn't happen again. There was no windows by the porch, so tossing the toys out the window and onto the porch wasn't possible. We woke up to loud cursing, now feeling nervous. The toys made their way back outside. All of a sudden, my aunt remembers the old lady who died in the house. Being superstitious, my aunt told my uncle it had to be the old lady. She figured that Sarah didn't quite understand the difference between a little girl and an adult, confusing the old lady for a little girl. It made sense. They were both described as female. Maybe Sarah mixed up her words. My aunt talked to my uncle into getting the house blessed. She was Catholic and firmly believed in the supernatural and the ability to be possessed. The Bible had many occurrences of ghosts. They invited the preacher over to bless the house with holy water, an attempt to rid the house of spirits. He did this for free as he accepted a small donation and a home-cooked meal. He blessed the house, inside and out, and rubbed holy water on the toys. He blessed the porch, rubbing holy water on the chairs, table, and door. Convinced of his secession, he declared that the spirits had left, and they wouldn't return. The house was cleansed. That night, the toys returned to the porch. My uncle couldn't believe it. He was fed up with it, but he was also obsessively convinced that he would catch one of us. He took it to a whole new level, and now we were all starting to get a bit nervous. It's like he's gone completely mad. The house had tile and hardwood floors. He grabbed a jar of flour and went to his room. The toys were put back on the dresser since it was the furthest thing from the bedroom door. He sifted the flour onto the floor around the dresser. When my aunt went to join him to go to sleep, he poured the flour all around the bed and in the front of the bedroom door. If anyone were to enter, they would leave prints in the floor. Assuming this trap was foolproof, he went to sleep. The girls and I started talking about ghosts and the old woman. I enjoy the paranormal, I find it fascinating, but my cousins, being raised Catholic, were afraid and paranoid, and for good reason. The toys ended up back outside that night, but it was what was discovered that morning that frightened everyone. Small, bare footprints were found in the flour. They weren't like what you would see in the movies. They were random and scattered. It was as if a person was dancing a string puppet around the room, touching the floor with a random foot in an awkward location. My uncle took my sister Sarah into the hallway where he then sifted more flour onto the floor. He placed Sarah on the floor, measuring her footprint. It didn't match. Sarah's prints were much smaller than these. They appeared to be that of a 6-year-old. After he measured all of our footprints, concluding that they couldn't possibly have come from any one of us, he finally started to grasp the idea that a ghost could be in the house. He wasn't superstitious, usually ignoring the possibility of it being something abnormal. But then, his fear began to show. Seeing that the prints were that of a child and not of a grown old woman, he got curious. He knew that the house had an old lady die in it, but he had never heard of any other deaths in the home. He wanted answers. This was a time before it was common to have a computer in most homes. He went to the library, looking up the history of ownership for the house. It was built in the 1950s and has had over 20 occupants call that house home. He took down the names from the local phone books, both old and new, and attempted to find out if any of the families had a little girl with the same name as Sarah's imaginary friend. It proved difficult as technology wasn't advanced in those days. You can find almost anyone, dead or alive, somewhere on the internet these days, but back then it was a lengthy journey of research. He called the real estate company to meet with the agent who sold him the house. He asked her if she had all the information on the previous owners and if any of them had a little girl die. The agent explained to him that she only had to reveal the deaths of anyone in the past 5 years. This pissed my uncle off. He was suspicious of the real estate company's secrets, figuring that her attitude meant that they knew more than what they were leading on. But no luck. She must get paid well to keep her mouth shut. That night, he went ahead to throw out the toys, hoping it would end this show. Finally, a night of peace, everything in its place. Sarah then demanded a baby doll, saying it was the only way her friend would be happy. He was reluctant at first, but her persistence overpowered him. He brought home a doll. About a month goes by and I moved out to live with another aunt, leaving my cousins and my sisters behind. She only lived 15 minutes away, but I longed for the moments to be alone. This aunt has no children, which means I didn't have to share, fight, and babysit. Although my sister Sarah continued her encounter with the little girl, They never had a physical occurrence in that house again. The curiosity got to my uncle and he went to the courthouse to look up death records. Sure enough, a little 8-year-old girl had died in the early 70s from blood cancer. She passed away in a hospital, but the house was her home at the time. My family no longer lives there. The house was too small, and with my cousins getting older, they needed more than one bathroom with a shower. I still wonder if the little girl is still haunting that house. Has she moved on? Is she taking some other child's toys away? Does she visit all the new occupants, or just the children with toys? Someday I hope to visit that house again and see if anyone else shared our experience. I can still remember the address to where we lived in Houston, Texas. The street was Dogwood Tree, but for legal reasons, I won't announce the house number. Story 2. A bit of backstory. I live in a 3-family apartment my grandmother owns. There are only 5 people who live in it. My uncle and his cousin on the 3rd floor, my grandmother and I on the 2nd, and another uncle on the 1st floor, and one cat who has free reign of the entire house, including the basement. She and my grandfather bought this house back in the 60s and had 6 children. My current room used to be my mother's and aunt's room when they were children. Ever since I was a young child, I spent a lot of my time in this house since both of my parents worked. Even back then, I always felt something was wrong with the place. It always felt like someone was watching you, but I never saw anything out of the ordinary. Eventually, my family and I moved, and I didn't spend a lot of time at my grandmother's house like I used to, only for holiday visits. However, once I graduated high school and attended a community college for a few years, I transferred to a university due to a transfer program they had for people who wanted to attain a bachelor's degree. Because of this, I moved into my grandmother's house since she lived close to the campus, and with how old she was getting, being almost 80 at this point, she could use the extra help around the house. Once I moved in, I started to get the same feeling of being watched. More specifically, being watched from my doorway that leads into my bedroom. It got to the point that I would never leave my doorroom open except for when I wasn't home. I would also hear a voice call out my name sometimes, and when I would ask my grandmother if she was calling me, she would say that she didn't. Some nights, when I would wake up to get a bottle of water, I would walk around in the dark with no problems, no feelings of being watched. But other nights, when I stepped out of my room, it felt like something was in the dark, waiting, and I would put on the kitchen light, even put on my bedroom light so I had a little bit of light to enter the hallway with. I know, a bit silly because light wouldn't stop something from attacking, but it provided a sense of safety nonetheless, and activity only escalated from there. My uncles and grandmother went to a casino with a group of family and friends for a couple of days, and their cousin stayed over his girlfriend's house during the time, leaving me the only person in the 3-family apartment. During this time, I was extremely skittish because the feeling of being watched intensified. One day, since I did not have a class to attend that day, I was sitting in the living room, watching TV when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I looked to the hallway and saw a young woman standing there and just simply disappeared. I was terrified since, as stated before, I was the only one home. and I'm also the only young female in the house, even when everyone else is here. During those nights, I locked my bedroom door and the light on until my family came home. I never told them about the woman since my grandmother and I had very different views on ghosts and the paranormal. She is a Catholic and does not believe in ghosts and that the spirits of people either go to heaven or hell and there is no in between. While I, on the other hand, feel as if spirits may not go to either and end up lingering in our plane of existence. She would also dismiss my claims of weird feelings in her house, saying that I was being paranoid or having an overactive imagination. 2 years went by, and I never saw the woman again fully, just seeing things from the corner of my eye. However, other strange things occurred. By then, I had graduated and was working part-time at a retail store while I looked for a full-time job. One night during dinner, my uncle who lives on the 3rd floor told us that one night when he was sitting at his computer desk in his bedroom and he looked at his doorway, which coincidentally his room is right above mine and his doorway lines up with mine since the 2nd and 3rd apartment have the same layout. He saw a young boy just staring at him. When he got up to see who it was, the boy had vanished. No one else was in his apartment at this time, and his 2 sons were at their mother's house that weekend, so it couldn't have been them. He has not mentioned if he has seen the boy since. A couple of months after that, I returned home from my shift and I could hear my grandmother talking to my uncle and his cousin who lived on the 3rd floor, and she was mentioning an experience she had during the weekend previous. Apparently, she was vacuuming her bedroom when suddenly everything on her dresser was knocked off. She thought maybe the cord from the vacuum somehow got up there and knocked everything down since it couldn't have been her cat because it was afraid of the vacuum. So she decided to go and vacuum the next room, which was the living room, and would pick up the knocked down items after. While she was vacuuming, she got hit in the back of the head. When she looked to see what had caused it, it was a hanging basket that decorated the room, which the hook of the basket was on the wall a yard away and could not have possibly hit her in the head by simply falling. It would have had to have been thrown to get that distance. So she immediately stopped what she was doing and went downstairs and sat on the front stoop for an hour or so. My uncle's cousin, her nephew, told her maybe it was her son who recently passed away, trying to reach out to let her know that he was okay, and did not understand what he was capable of doing as a spirit. However, I disagree, but never worded my objection since I didn't want to scare my grandmother, nor destroy her hope that it was her son trying to make contact with her. I currently live in the same residence, and while I haven't seen anything again, other than the seeing things from the corner of my eyes previously mentioned, and still feel like I'm being watched, no one has mentioned any other experiences. I spoke to my mother, who already knew how bad I felt about the place even when I was little. She said that the place always gave her the creeps when she was a child, especially her bedroom, and she told me that when they first moved in, her room was painted red, and the walls looked as if they were bleeding. And she always believed the basement was haunted by an older man, but she did not give me a lot of details on this or any of her experiences if she had any. Recently, I offered to switch rooms with my grandmother since she gets cold easily even in summer, and knowing my room stays warm easily, I thought it would give her more comfort. And she said no. I asked her why, and when she told me why, I could only stare at her. This woman, who told me she never believed in ghosts or spirits, said that she doesn't like to stay in that room because she hears voices call out her name all the time in there. Story 3. Max Dunham here. Got another weird experience to share for you. One that happened earlier today, actually, so it's still fresh in my mind. Could be a ghost, could be nothing, but it was weird and I can't wrap my head around it. You remember my second experience, the one I had during my childhood, about the laughing voice one night? Hope so, since you mentioned it along with a few creepy night clown encounters in one of your subscriber story videos. No, it didn't happen again, but I've been living in the same house for a few years now, moved back in from the one with the nightly tomato thief. Nothing dramatic happened, but it was subtle and quite odd. So there were a couple of guys cleaning the house earlier today, and I was keeping the dogs company in the laundry room as they were finishing up. They kept leaving the front door open a lot during their work, so I had to turn the AC off earlier and left the door leading to the backyard from the laundry room wide open from when I had to come in, considering it was already warm inside and planned on turning the AC back on once they were gone anyways. I was petting one of the dogs when I heard the sound of a door slowly creak and turned around to look over at the entryway past the kitchen, thinking that it was them closing the door on their way out. I couldn't see the front door from where I was, but was looking to see if I could catch the outside light fading as the door closed. It never came, as I eventually remember that they left the entryway light on. However, when I heard the sound of a door shutting, I suddenly realized that the sound was coming from the same room I was in, and turned around to see the door I had left open earlier, and had remained open for several minutes prior, was now shut. At first, I had thought it was just the wind, but a quick look at the hinges and a reminder of which direction I had opened the door several times before made me doubt the notion almost immediately. They were facing inside the room, meaning that the door opened inwards and could not have possibly been blown shut. I know it wasn't one of the dogs nudging it into a closing motion because none of them were anywhere near it when it had started moving, and even if they somehow did, that specific door requires some force to close all the way. If it just gently swings closed like it did, it would usually either stop at the frame or the lock wouldn't latch properly, meaning that it might look closed but could have easily been pulled or pushed open without having to turn the knob. None of these were the case, as I had tugged on the door to confirm that it had, in fact, shut all the way. While I'm telling you this, there is something I forgot to mention in my last story regarding this place. While true that my family usually does do whatever they can to avoid potential hauntings, it should be noted that my grandfather committed suicide in this house about a year before my mother, brother, and myself had first moved in back when I was a kid. If you look at my previous experience in this place, you'll note that I suggested he wasn't around at the time by stating that my brother and myself were the only males in the house. This is why. Maybe the door closing was my grandfather trying to keep the hot air out, or maybe it was just some kind of vacuum effect. I don't know, but it was weird. It creeped me out at the time, and I thought it was interesting enough to share.